Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Martha Tatarnic welcomes the Reverend Kyle Norman to the show. Kyle is a priest, author, and speaker. He holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy, a master's in divinity, and a doctorate in spiritual formation. He currently lives in Kamloops, British Columbia with his wife and son. Currently, Kyle is the rector of St. Paul's Cathedral and dean of the Territory of the People. Kyle is also the author of Alive, Loved, and Free, Finding Jesus When Faith is Hard, which tackles the tricky issues of feeling discouraged in our faith. As always, please take a moment to rate and review the show and share Future Christian with a friend. You can connect with Lauren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Thanks so much for joining us as we faithfully discern the future of the church.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I'm your host for today's episode, Martha Tatarnic, and I'm so very happy to be joined today by the very Reverend Kyle Norman. We are fellow colleagues in the Anglican Church of Canada. I don't think that we have actually met in person, but we have talked over the years and had some fun church nerd moments.
Exactly. Yes. We haven't met in person, but I've always enjoyed chatting with you when we get to geek out over stuff. So it's my pleasure to be here. So thank you very much for having me.
All right. Well, we have some exciting things to talk about today, namely your brand new book, Alive, Loved, and Free. But we're going to get to that in a moment because it's important to just give our listeners, our audience, a sense of who you are and what you're about. So, Kyle, maybe you can share with all of us a little bit about your faith journey, what that has looked like in the past and what that looks like now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in the Anglican Church. My first memories were sitting in the front of the church, reading the liturgical book. So before Sunday school, I would see how far I could get before I had to go down. And so it was always...
That really says a lot, I have to say.
Yeah, exactly. And so just grew up in the church and spent some time as a youth worker, had the call to ministry when I was in grade 10. And then seminary, and I was in a church in the BC. Then I was 13 years in Calgary and have now moved into being the rector of St. Paul's Cathedral and the dean of the diocese. So I have quite the complicated role, but I get to talk with a wide variety of people in the church, ministers, both lay and ordained, new members joining the Anglican Church, and in some of our rural areas, just going to the church that's there. And so it's quite a unique kind of thing. So it's been a fun ride so far.
Okay, well, just a couple of little follow-up things about what you just shared. It's amazing, like, how many people get their call in that age range. Like, it was the same for me. I was 15. It was, like, grade 10. And I've, like, talked to so many people that it's that age. It's 15. And not just, like, call to ministry, but, like, call to a variety of, like, vocations. So I just had to comment on that because I find it remarkable. And then because our listeners aren't all Anglican or even primarily Anglican, can you just say a little bit more about what that role of dean is? Because not everybody would know what that title is.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. So the dean in the Anglican context is, so it's an area role. So we are headed by a bishop, and the bishop is, the senior pastor amongst the pastors and the one who kind of heads up the diocese. And so And the dean is kind of like the second in command. And so I help the bishop navigate the complexity of ministry in the diocese. And so we have about 14 parishes and 31 different congregations in the territory of the people where I am. It's a smaller diocese.
Okay.
And so I deal with the clergy, I help manage conflicts if they arrive, or maybe we should say when they arrive. And,
Yeah, when.
yeah. And then so I aid the bishop, and I take some things that I can do so that she is freed up to do only the things that the bishop can do.
Okay, that's great. That's just helpful for our listeners to kind of have a sense of
Absolutely.
how our Anglican polity works.
Yes, exactly.
So, Kyle, is there a spiritual practice that you're finding particularly meaningful right now, particularly as you navigate those various roles and leadership?
Yeah, I have always been a fan of morning prayer. Like, again, as an Anglican from the liturgical book, so not just praying in the morning, but doing this daily office. And so that's always been kind of sustaining for me, and it goes up and down depending on the busyness in the seasons, but it really helps me to be able to do that in the morning before I go to my phone, before I check my emails, before I do anything, to be able to go and sit down and engage in this time of prayer. It helps settles me and helps prepare me for what I might be facing.
Well, one of the things that I love about doing this podcast is noting those connections, like across the various conversations that we have, and especially, because we have conversations across a variety of denominations. I have said this so many times that I feel like I'm beginning to sound like an advertisement for the daily office, but so many people name that as like the practice that is grounding and like connecting for them, and not just Anglicans. Like, I find it totally remarkable.
It's fabulous. Part of my when I did my doctorate, part of my doctoral research was taking a group of people and leading them in morning prayer for 10 weeks in this research study I had to do. And by week 3 or 4, the majority of them had said, this is a defining practice of my life. That is, one person said, morning prayer has hacked my morning, right? Because it reframed everything, right? And so it's really a powerful activity.
So, future Christian listeners, if you haven't tried the daily office, it might be something to really consider, because I think that this is a message that we keep getting across our various guests. It's pretty cool.
Absolutely.
Okay, so like I said at the beginning, we are here to talk about your brand new book called Alive, Loved, and Free. And I am really grateful that you sent me an advance copy. I had an opportunity to read it. It is such a personal book, and it is such a pastoral book. Like, it is just like exploding with heart for God's people is how I would define it.
Yeah.
So maybe you can just get us into the premise of the book, especially like what prompted your writing it.
Yeah. So the book follows my journey of dealing with or going through a period of time, which was the hardest kind of spiritual time that I've ever been a part of, dealing with my wife's cancer diagnosis and subsequent chemotherapy and all of that. And I'm very, very clear that this is my story as priest and as caregiver. It's not her story. She gets to tell her story. And I'm also clear, like, I had the better deal of this, right? Like, she had chemotherapy and nausea and hair loss, and, I struggled with prayer, right? Like, but, I was unprepared for the just the amount of spiritual upheaval I would end up in, having to walk with my wife through this. I talked about morning prayer, and I couldn't pray. Like that liturgy just dried up. And I had such a hard time dealing with everything that it really changed the way that I understand ministry and how to pastor people in the midst of this seemingly difficult time in their lives.
Okay, so it was really like a matter of like the rubber hitting the road for you in terms of things that maybe had been theoretical or like at a distance, and suddenly you're living it. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And, like it's easy. So my wife was diagnosed on Maundy, Thursday. And so part of this is also like part of the book takes my journey and my struggles and pairs it with the great 3 days. So Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday. And that's how I structure the book. But yeah, up until that point, I could make my solemn meditations on Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday from the ease of my seat, right? And it was all very, theological and biblical, and it's so great, but it was very easy. And then in the midst of that time, feeling just almost probably for the first time, feeling this visceral, I have no clue what to do, and I have no clue where God is in the midst of this. And so very, very personal. And because we don't always talk about these kind of things in the church, in any sort of kind of real way, again, was completely unprepared for what was coming.
Yeah, so let's pick that apart a little bit more. Like, what are the things that we're missing? Like, certainly we have a faith and a tradition that, keeps like our mortality and the frailty of life quite viscerally in front of us. We're recording this the day after Ash Wednesday, which, like we get to show up and be told you're gonna die. So
sure. Yeah.
Here's some ashes. It's not going to last forever, right? Like we have a lot of honesty in our tradition that I think is like quite in contrast to the world around us, which has a bit of an allergy to talking about aging and frailty and death. So like what would you identify as kind of the missing pieces like in what we're not talking about and how we're not kind of engaging people?
Well, and that's I think it's hard to pick apart in some sense. I know that for myself, part of my struggle was that I had adopted a personality that, and maybe because I'm the priest, that I have to have everything put together. Right. And I have to have the answers and I have to be okay. And so when people say, Kyle, how are you doing? I just say, fine. Right. And I think, I brought that in as the priest, but I think so often we cultivate that in the community as well, that the community is the place that the church, even though we disagree with it and we know theologically it's not the case, but we, like, in practical terms, I think sometimes the community develops this attitude that this is the place to go when you have all the answers figured out and everything's okay. And you can sit in the pew with the people that are like you. And when people ask you, how are you doing? All they want is, I'm fine. And so when people come up against something, and I'm sure, as a pastor, I'm sure that you have found this as well, people enter into a time of discouragement or struggle, and they say, I have to leave the church. And once I figure it all out, well, then I'll come back. Well, 9 times out of 10, they don't. Right? And so rather than the church being this place, this gathering place where it's okay not to be okay, And it's okay to articulate that. And why we've developed that attitude, I'm not exactly sure, but I do know that there needs to be a willingness to articulate those deep hurts of the soul and those deep discouragements, um, and build a culture that says that these are the places in which we might actually find community more, but also find God in the midst of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there definitely is a real strain of Christian thought and culture around, the strength of your faith being measured kind of by an absence of doubt, like that like your faith is strong enough to move mountains. Like you're not going to acknowledge the possibility that it's not going to work out or that you don't have everything figured out. I mean, I think that can be a part of Christian culture. I think maybe also what you're naming is in our Anglican tradition, there can be a politeness to our church culture, like a reserved kind of nature to our church culture that people do want to present as having things together.
I think so. And that's part of why I wanted to write the book, right? Is in every church that I've been a part of, and I'm 22 years into ministry, and I've been in various different churches, from rural churches to an urban church and now to a cathedral. And I have met faithful Christian men and women who deep within carry a certain amount of shame or guilt because they feel they're doing it wrong, right?
Yeah.
Because they read in books or they hear in a sermon that God answers prayer, and they think, well, I've never had God answer one of my prayers. Or, this person talks so passionately about feeling the love of Jesus, but I don't know if I've ever felt the love of Jesus. And so there must be some, and these are people who have sat in the same pew for 30 years. Yeah. Right. And so what I wanted to do was articulate that this kind of sense of Pollyanna, everything is okay, is not actually the biblical understanding of faith at all. And we need to be honest about that.
And you figured that out in
viscerally,
a very personal way. Yeah. I think that sense of inadequacy can be really rife. And I hear it a lot around prayer, especially that people kind of feel like everybody else understands how to pray, but it feels not straightforward for me, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I remember, and this was probably just maybe 2 years or so before Alicia's diagnosis, and just kind of recognizing nobody had ever actually taught me to pray. Like right, in terms of like, I could say the words, but it was kind of assumed, you'll figure it out. All through university, all through Sunday school, all through seminary. And nobody had kind of said, let's really talk about what prayer is in this kind of internal way. And let's talk about what it means to pray our supplications, but let's also talk about lament and how that is a really authentic way. Like, you can scream and you can yell and you can do all of that. And so I had done a lot of reading, which I think was very preparatory and very kind of well-timed divinely for what I was going to be heading into. But that didn't take away the visceralness of being in those places at that time.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. So, connected to like that sense of inadequacy and I think that feeling, that kind of scared feeling a lot of people can have about like, maybe their faith doesn't measure up to what is expected or what others have experienced. You share a lot of other stories that I think are very much related to this of people who have come to believe that they're like just not worthy of God's love, that they're not good enough, that their faith isn't good enough. That can also be connected to forgiveness, and like maybe other people can be forgiven, but if they knew what I had done or who I am inside, like they would know that I can't be forgiven, that there's like kind of this haunting sense of inadequacy that can like play out in a lot of different ways in the minds and experiences of us and of our people. Like, do you have kind of a sense of where these messages come from, how people end up feeling this way?
I think some of it, and some of the people that I remember talking to, some of it is what they've been taught. And they've been taught it from, well, frankly, churches, or they've been taught it from religious family members that they grew up with. There's this one person who, for every infraction, every mistake, would wave their finger and say, God will get you for that. Right. And so they, and so they grew up feeling that God is just this angry judge in the sky with, just waiting just to write this divine ticket for every little thing. And they took that upon themselves. I think another area is, we live in a soundbite kind of world, and the soundbite culture of an easy answer to something is, I think, one of the places where these things come out, right? God is not picking on you. God is handpicking you to bestow his glory. Well, wait, what does that mean? Like, and all of these are just band-aids that we put onto the suffering of others so that we don't have to deal with it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very true. I think that the vulnerability of other people, if it's just a little too front and center, can be way too much of a reminder of our own vulnerability. So I think that that's very, very true.
Yeah, I think so, right? I think that there is that kind of understanding of we don't want to deal with the stuff that is vulnerable, the stuff that makes us feel uncomfortable. And so we kind of, placate everything under this thin veneer of spirituality, which doesn't actually help in any sort of way.
Yeah, I agree. And, the other thing that I think about a lot is that, like, churches by no means have a monopoly on making people feel inadequate and not good enough.
Sure.
Like, that is, you talk about the soundbite culture, but, like, just spend some time on social media or ask like some of our kids who are growing up in a social media age how inadequate they feel on a regular basis, how much like we are bombarded with messages about all of the ways in which we really could and should be better.
Oh, absolutely. Like, and it's a huge thing. I have this little reflection. And it was a very real thing, as somebody who's on Facebook, on somebody, on Instagram, realizing that Bobby Flay's cat has more Instagram followers than me. Like, this celebrity chef's cat is killing it. And I'm like, what? Like, and it's just so easy because we live in a culture that says this is who you should be, and this is what you should be doing. That kind of message is ultimately condemning. And because we have built this world around us that says this, how can we not sometimes take those condemnations upon ourselves? And it's rife. It's everywhere.
Well, I think it really is. And I think that to some degree, and, I could be wrong about this because I didn't grow up in that version of the church at all, like the angry judge in the sky version of the church. I didn't grow up in, so I don't know like how that feels like to grow up with that message. But I wonder sometimes whether it is the more insidious messages that like just get baked into your subconscious that are harder to talk back to because you almost don't even realize that they're there.
Absolutely. And you don't realize they're there until something comes and shakes you up.
Yes.
Right. And I didn't know that, like imposter syndrome is a thing for me. I'm a middle child. I'm always comparing myself. And that is something that I've kind of struggled with. But I didn't know how deeply there was this little voice that connected God's judgment to those things. Until all of a sudden I'm asking, like, if I was a better priest, would this not have happened? If I was a better husband, and I didn't think I would ever ask those questions, but all of a sudden those come rising up within me. And again, that was part of the upheaval. And it was just like, what is going on here? And then that really just kind of created, like that was in 2015, we're now in 2025, that created a 10-year journey of me wanting to explore and write about this sense of discouragement in faith and wrestling in faith. And what if actually the position of faith is wrestling, and it's in the wrestling that we find that we actually are wrestling with the God who comes to us, right? And doesn't just leave us, doesn't just push us to the side, doesn't just wait till we have it all figured out, but is actually the one who comes and dwells with us in that moment.
Yeah. That's so beautiful. So, like, do you feel, are there a couple of key things that you think the church could be doing that could help toward this healthier faith, that could, help people in their discouragement and doubts and inadequacy?
Yeah, like I think that, depending on how you, where you're asking that question from in terms of the church, right? So if you're asking from the position of church leadership, one of the things that I think that priests and pastors need to do is we need to be vulnerable and we need to be honest. We need to be able, and not this fake vulnerability, this fake honesty that says, oh, back in the day, well, that's when I was struggling, but now I have all the answers. We need to be willing to articulate, I don't know what to do, and I don't have the answers, and I need some help for whatever is going on. We need to be able to do that in order to create that culture that allows somebody to say, I hear myself in that. And then therefore, then community is built. And then I think for the church, I don't want to talk about programs or anything like that, but I do think we need to develop the capacity to sit with each other in our struggles and not rush to the solutions, and not always be quick to kind of lay out the pathway, right? To say, oh, well, I've had that too, and this is how I went through it. And that might be true, fabulous, but that can feel condemning, as if, well, I've progressed, and when you progress too, then we will be able to chat about that. Well, what does it look like for you to sit in the ashes with that person? And like Job's friends, before they started talking, like just sit there, not actually pose any answers, and just be there in care and support, because that's what people are wanting for. They want to know they're not alone in whatever they're struggling with. And then in the midst of that, we grow in our capacity to find God in the midst of that. So, I think probably vulnerability and honesty in the midst of the church culture, I think is a big thing.
Yeah, I think it's a big thing too, and I think that you're right. It can be modeled from the pulpit. I would add a little footnote, though. I would just say, like, as you know, I'm a writer, and there's like hardly a vulnerability that I haven't articulated loud, either like in sermons or in writing or what have you. And, you know, some of it's like not that pretty. Like, there is an appetite for pastors that present as having it all figured out. Like, it can make people a little squeamish, I think, sometimes when that is named so front and center. That's not to say I don't fully agree with you, because I do. I just think like leaders should be aware that it does come with some risks.
Well, and it comes from some risk. And what we should say is that we're not talking about sensationalism either, right? Like there is, and we're not talking about working out your own stuff in the midst of people, right? Like there is a way in which you share your vulnerability in a way which puts its eyes on you, which is sensationalist, or in which you are using your congregation as your therapist, right? And that's unhealthy whatsoever, right? And so I think what we need to do is, it is a fine line of saying we need to be honest and real about struggles, about hurts, about our insufficiencies, and struggles, and be honest about that. Also recognizing that in the pastoral relationship, that naturally creates a certain amount of boundaries. And we need to recognize what those boundaries are and work within those boundaries for our health, but also for their health too. Like that's just a loving thing to do. So it is, there is a nuance there that we need to recognize. You're right.
Yeah, I think that those are some excellent guidelines, and you're right. Like it's sort of a combination, I think, of good boundaries and common sense and a bit of gut instinct too.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, the book is so personal, but you talk about like just some very universal experiences as well. And I would say particularly like some universal questions that I certainly hear like time and time again as a pastor, as a leader in the church, that, you know, there's like very common pitfalls for people spiritually. And I like how you get into these pitfalls, drawing on a bunch of different resources, like your own walk of faith, the things that you learned through your wife's illness, the resources of the Bible and of our prayer life and of our worship life. Like it all, you kind of draw on all of it. But I wonder whether we can just talk about a few of these questions.
Sure.
And maybe you can just share what you have learned about what is helpful in how we respond to these questions when they come up, and maybe what's not helpful. So, you know, I think the first one and the biggest one and the most common one is like, why is this happening to me? Like, if God loves me, why would God do this to me? Or like, you know, I try to be a good person. Like, how can this, like, basically is like there no justice.
Absolutely. You know, I remember wrestling with those questions in the midst of, you know, because you ask those questions in the midst of sickness and death and all that stuff. And so when my wife was going through cancer, I asked, why is this happening? And it dawned on me, wait a minute. If somebody were actually be able to say to me, okay, Kyle, Alicia got cancer because of this reason. This is the reason, and this is how it's going to work out, and all that kind of stuff. Right. Would that actually make it less painful? No. Like, that actually wouldn't help me at all. I actually think it would make things worse. And so I actually think that there is, and hopefully people understand what I'm saying, almost this beauty in the fact that we don't get an answer, right? Because when we try to put an answer, like Job's friends, we're almost probably 100% wrong. And so there's this, so it's wonderful that God doesn't give us an answer. God's response is to come to us. God gives us a presence, right? And so, nobody can, unfortunately, why is this happening? I can't say why this is happening. But what I can say, what I think the Bible says, what I think that I've experienced, is that in the midst of that question and asking that question, and as gut-wrenching and visceral as it is, God meets us in that. God meets that question not with a rationale, but with God's loving and grace-filled presence.
Yeah. So that move away from like trying to litigate it to like helping people be attentive to God's presence.
Yeah. And we can ask those questions. Job asked those questions. The psalmists totally asked those questions. So like, rip away.
Jesus did.
Jesus
like,
did.
my God,
Absolutely.
why have you forsaken me?
Yeah. So ask away, yell, scream, stomp your feet, do all of that. That is a faithful response. But we don't always get the answers, and it's actually okay not to have the answers because God gives us God's presence.
Yeah, I like that. I like giving tons of permission for those questions to be part of faithful living.
Yeah.
But also the lack of answers to be part of it too.
Yeah.
So I think the next refrain that I hear a lot is pretty connected to that that piece around being more attentive to the presence of God. Like, what if I can't feel God's love? What if, like, I hear other people's spiritual experiences and they don't match up with my own?
Absolutely. And I actually had someone, so the title of a chapter is "What If I Don't Feel God's Love?" And somebody actually asked me that after a service. The service was done. I preached, did the communion. The person came up to me afterwards and said, "Kyle, do you always experience God's love? Because I don't." And so what I articulated her in that brief moment and what I tried to articulate in the chapter, I have this phrase, God's love is a fact, not a feeling. Like, God's love is not the equivalent of a schoolyard crush that just makes us feel positive and butterfly-y and Twitter-pated all the time. That's not what God's love is. God's love is a fact of God's existence to which we claim in boldness that we are surrounded by God's love because that is what Jesus shows us. Now, I think we can feel God's love, and the closer we get to Jesus, the closer we get to those times of feeling God's love. But if we are in a season where it's like, I don't feel God's love in this moment or whatever, then that doesn't mean God's love is absent. The lack of feeling doesn't denote the lack of existence because God's love is a fact of who God is.
Yeah, I like that. And I think it's probably also related to that culture change that you name. Like, I think the more that people can share the variety of ways in which they experience God at work in their lives, experience God's presence and love, I think the more that helps other people to find the language that works for their experiences as well. Like, to say it's not a cookie cutter kind of thing, right? Like, we don't all experience God showing up in the same way.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely.
What about forgiveness? What about people who think that they can't be forgiven? How do you respond to that?
When I've recently had that question, and one of the things that I found myself reflecting on and doing is walking through them the parable of the unmerciful servant. And at least that first part, and just the dramatic of, Jesus tells a story of the servant who owes 10,000 talents. And I say, just let's stop there. That the whole understanding of 10,000 talents in those days was 10,000 was the biggest number. A talent was worth 20 years of wage. And so this servant owed the master like an equivalent of a gazillion dollars, right? And the whole point being, and what Jesus is trying to say, is that forgiveness is uncalculable, right? And so there is nothing that we can do to work ourselves out of that forgiveness. And it's just not a thing. And, theologians, sometimes we can parse around what is the unforgivable sin, the blasphemy of the Spirit, and what does that mean, and blah, blah, blah. But if you're asking that question out of a desire to really, enter into the forgiveness of God, you're not committing, you're not blaspheming the Spirit. So let's not even worry about that. Sometimes I think what is hardest in forgiveness is not being forgiven, is accepting forgiveness, is daring to believe that it's true. And so I try to reframe it. I try to walk through that parable and say there is no, forgiveness is unlimited. It is always held out for us. There is no sense in which that forgiveness will be withheld. And so the question isn't you are unforgivable. The question that we can talk about is, what does it mean for you to accept it? And what does it mean for you to dare to live in the midst of that? And then that just moves the conversation in a different direction, which deals with struggles and whatever was going on in their lives.
Yeah. Okay, let's do one more. So I think this is also a big one. Doubt. People will tell me all the time that they're not very good Christians because they have lots of doubts, because there are things that they don't understand or things that they can't accept. There are lots of people who tell me that they're, not a believer at all because they, wrestle with certain doctrines or proclamations. So what's a helpful response to people's doubt?
Well, the helpful response is twofold. One is we need to remember that Israel is wrestling, right? And so Israel is named Israel because he wrestled with God, right? And so that sense of wrestling with something we don't understand, wrestling with where is God, wrestling with I don't get this doctrine, that's actually a faithful response. And so you can lean into that. You can recognize that you are faithful and still have some doubts, and that's okay. But then I also like to talk a little bit about doubting Thomas. And, it's just one, I love doubting Thomas. We give him a bad rap, but it's unfairly. But it's an amazing thing. So and we're going to read the story just after Easter, but, we all know the story. Thomas says, oh, unless I put the nails in my hands and blah, 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 and all this, I'm not going to believe. And so we kind of lean into that. But there's this little phrase in the text that says, after 8 days, Jesus returns and Thomas is amongst them. Okay, wait. So for 8 days, for a whole week, Thomas is in a place where he doesn't know what to believe. And he doesn't believe in the resurrection, and he doesn't get it, and he doesn't understand how all this works out. But he is willing to journey with a community as they talk about the story, as they sing the hymns, as they pray for each other. And Thomas is there saying, I don't get it. But he's willing to journey with them. And then at some point in the journey, he meets the risen Lord. And so just because you have a doubt, and it might even be a big doubt, again, that doesn't mean you have to separate yourself from the community. Keep a part of the community, and it might actually be in the midst of might not take 8 days. It might take a little bit longer, right? But in the midst of that community, as you sing the community songs, as you join with the people, and as you listen to the stories, it might be in that context that you meet the risen Lord, as opposed to, I'm going to leave and be by myself, and then once I figure it out, then I'll come back. It might actually be in that place that you meet the risen Lord and you find the answer that you're looking for.
Yeah. And, I think further to that, I think we really need to frame in the context of community the gift of doubt, because if it, when communities get way too hyped up on certainty, that can result in a lot of
Absolutely.
hysteria and bad behavior and so on. That gift of belief and doubt all sort of working itself out in discernment in a community. Thomas plays an important role in the post-resurrection days of okay, what is this? What is going on here? That's a really important question. Did everybody just have a collective delusion, or is there something real here? So yeah, I think I think framing that communally and framing that scripturally is so important.
Well, and for the church community as well. So Thomas does believe, my Lord and my God. But then it's not all roses after that. The community still struggled. No. They still had to work really hard against all sorts of things that they never thought they'd have to deal with and try to figure it out. Circumcision versus uncircumcision, barbarians, Scythian, all of this kind of stuff. And some places they did very, very well. And some places they had to work really hard to maintain the community. And so articulating the gamut of doubt and struggle within the Christian experience as a whole, I think is important.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely true. And, I think that can be very much in the category of discouragement, spiritual discouragement, if people think that they're going to have this moment of clarity, this moment of revelation, that is just going to settle everything. And then you've arrived, then everything is figured out. We never get to just arrive. We always are a work in progress.
Absolutely. And that's a beautiful thing. But also we need to articulate that means that we're always moving into, in some sense, another place of uncertainty, right? And as we need to figure out, okay, so where does my life with God, what does that mean in this new place?
Yeah. I think, being clear about expectations is really important. So what has changed for you most as a church leader through this 10-year journey, through writing this book? What's the biggest takeaway for you?
I think for me, the biggest takeaway for me is I feel like I lead more from the heart than the head now. And yeah, I like that at the beginning, I really appreciated that you said that the book is a pastoral book, and you said that there's a lot of heart in it. And that makes me feel good, because I think, not that I was this overly heady person, however, but I can find it easy just to live in my head. And so I think I have grown in my capacity to be that heart-filled presence for a person, rather than the learned theologian, if that makes sense. And so I think I've grown in that capacity, and I think that's only made me a better preacher. I think it's made me a better pastor, and I think it makes me a better priest.
Yeah, the word that's coming to mind for me, and I may or may not be using it correctly, is just empathy. That it seems to me that there's a big part of this journey that just found you like walking a lot more closely with people's lived experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And engaging my faith, like there was an inner transformation that happened within me as well. So engaging my faith in a whole different way. And not that I didn't have my personal relationship with Jesus before, but I would say it's stronger. It's maybe more else. I would maybe say it's more intense, but it's also more personal, more emotive now than before.
So the corollary to that question is, what would you want the biggest takeaway to be for the church? What would you most like the church to be communicating?
That's a good question. I recognize, so in this moment, I recognize that there's a lot of anxiety in the Western world. We're in Canada. Your listeners are probably some in the States as well, and I have friends in the States, and like tensions are ramped up, and I think it's tempting on each side for the churches to articulate a position, right? To articulate something that we can say that will make it make sense and help us navigate this. And what I'm feeling in this moment is perhaps the place is not articulating the right answer, the right position, but just articulating the anxiety and what people are feeling and saying it's okay to feel that way, and God meets us in this place, and let's pray from that place.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I think just being attentive to that desire in times of anxiety and uncertainty to be the strong leader, to be the one with the answers, to, have some magic bullets for people. I think just articulating that particular pitfall does make it easier to live in the tension, to pray from the tension, to look for the presence of God. I think that's super important. Okay, so the book is Alive, Loved, and Free. I highly recommend it. How can people get their hands on this book?
So you can get it by going on to Amazon.ca. So it's published through KDP and Amazon. And so that is really the only place that you can get it. It's available in paperback, but also in Kindle.
Awesome. Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back for some closing questions. Welcome back to the Future Christian Podcast. I am with the very Reverend Kyle Norman, and we're going to wrap up with some closing questions. Now, Kyle, these are questions that we ask all of our guests, and we always tell them that you are welcome to take these questions as seriously as you want or not.
Sure.
Okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Kyle, if you were Pope for the day, what would that 24 hours entail?
Well, it would definitely be riding around in the Pope Mobile. Like I would hit a drive-through. Honestly, I would do that. I think if I was Pope for a day, I would want to try to get together some Christian leaders and just say, brass tacks, our divisions are not helpful. How can we work together? And just let's have those conversations.
All right. In the Pope Mobile, maybe.
In the Pope Mobile, as we go through McDonald's. I don't know.
Well, that could be the hook.
Yeah.
The invitation comes with.
Exactly.
The drive-through and the Pope-mobile. How could anybody resist?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, who is a theologian or historical Christian figure that you would want to meet, have a meal with, bring back to life?
Well, what I would, there's so many, but Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I would, because I think what he articulated in his life in terms of state religion and how it was responding to oppression and violence and autocracy and all that stuff is what we are seeing today. And so if there's anybody who could help peel back the onion layers a little bit, I would say, here's a beer, go. Right? And just have a chat with him. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that answer has been coming up a little bit more lately. And I do think that it is a measure of the time and space that we're in right now. Yeah. What are your hopes? Oh, sorry. What will history remember from this current time and place?
Ooh. I think history will remember the rise and fall of social media. Okay. I think, what was it? Like TikTok was canceled for 24 hours and people went nuts. And so I think from the standpoint of 100 years from now or 200, when they look back, I think it's going to be social media is a thing, but I think it's going to rise and it's going to come crashing down or replaced by something new. And I think that's what people are going to remember.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. What are your hopes for the future of Christianity, for the future of the church?
My hopes for the future of the church is a growth in vibrant but smaller churches, right? So I think God's vision for the church is not global denomination, right? I think God's vision is not where every church is a mega church. I think God's vision is small pockets of Christians gathering together in vibrancy and passion. And that might be 100 people here and 50 here and maybe 200 here and all that stuff, but smaller yet more connected, authentic, and vibrant Christian communities.
Beautiful. Kyle, where can people find more about you?
So I have a website, which is www.revkylenorman.ca. So that's where you can find me. And then if you are in the Kamloops area, then you can just show up at St. Paul's Cathedral. And I'm there every Sunday. So those are kind of the places that you can find me. And, I'm on TikTok and I'm on Facebook. So you can just Google Reverend Kyle Norman and you'll find me.
And the Kamloops area is quite scenic, right? Like it's quite beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah, it's great. We got, we have hills. We're surrounded within about an hour drive. I don't know, something like 300 lakes. Like it is a beautiful environment. And so, yeah, if you're coming up, Vancouver's great, but Kamloops is where it's at. So come to Kamloops.
Okay, so come for the scenery, stay for a conversation with
Absolutely.
Kyle.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely. There you go.
Sounds good. Okay, well, I so appreciate your time today and this conversation and this book. We always end with a word of peace, so may the peace of the Lord be always with you, Kyle.
And also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Lauren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.